Hi everyone, Ian Bremmer here, and in the midst of a serious global crisis, I thought I would explain what a geopolitical recession is, because we're in one, and it makes the ability to respond to coronavirus a lot more difficult than it normally would be. You know, we have economic recessions, boom and bust cycles, right? Every 7 years on average since World War II. Some are really big, like in 2008. Some are comparatively small. And because they happen frequently, we are used to them. We can identify them. We know we don't like them. We have tools to respond in terms of stimulus and fiscal expansion and monetary easing. And we even can define a technical recession as when you have 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. Geopolitics have boom and bust cycles too. And it's when the global order either is cohering under a set of values and standards and institutions with a geopolitical order that is relatively aligned with the institutions that have been created and undergird it, or when they're falling apart. And we've been in a geopolitical boom cycle for a long time. I mean, arguably since the end of World War II, when the United States created the United Nations, the IMF, and the World Bank, and both its allies as well as its former enemies were made a part of that system. We're now in a bust cycle, the end of the US-led global order, what I call a GZERO world, not a G7 or a G20. And this geopolitical recession makes it a lot harder to respond to a crisis. The political institutions are less resilient. They don't cohere. And we see that playing out right now. It makes me a little more pessimistic about what the next few months will bring, irrespective of the epidemiology of the coronavirus. And there are 3 different ways that plays out, 3 different components of the geopolitical recession. I thought I'd go through them with you today. First is inside the United States, inside our democracies. We have a lot more feeling of illegitimacy, feeling that the system is rigged against the citizens, and therefore less willingness to support leaders who need to lead to be able to respond to get us out of this coronavirus crisis. And of course, this plays out right now inside the United States, where the divisiveness, both being led by Trump in saying, we're going to close borders, that's the way we respond, the Democrats are fake news, it's all a hoax what they're doing against me, and the Democrats taking anything that Trump does and saying this is the worst possible response. He's trying to undermine the country and undermine the system. There's no willingness to work together. And it's not just in the United States. We see this playing out in Brazil today with President Bolsonaro and forces against him. We see it playing out in other countries across Europe with real challenges internally for those governments. So a geopolitical recession, first and foremost, weakening and delegitimizing democracies around the world. Secondly, a geopolitical recession in the alliances around the world and the ability of international politics to be run in a stable and consistent way. When the geopolitical order is not in flux, you expect that in a crisis, countries can work together. It's a global crisis. You want a global response. Well, you know, we had an emergency G7 meeting of central bank governors and finance ministers. They said they would monitor the ongoing situation. There was no coordination. You have the U.S. government coming out and referring to coronavirus as the China virus, the Wuhan virus, the foreign virus. It's an America first response. You have the Chinese government, official spokespeople for China, saying that the virus was manufactured by the U.S. Army and brought to China, a conspiracy theory to undermine the Chinese. Between the US and the Europeans, you have President Trump giving a speech saying that he's going to cut off foreign travel from Europe. You have the Europeans outraged that the President of the United States did not clear that, negotiate that, discuss that with his key allies before making the announcement. So not only do you have a lack of coordination in responding globally to a global crisis, but you also have global leaders actively blaming each other. And then, so that's the geopolitical side. And then you have the institutional side, which is the institutions themselves are increasingly not aligned to the geopolitical order, so they can't respond very effectively. So if you think about the World Health Organization, which again is meant to be global, but the level of access they had into China, which increasingly is the biggest part of global growth, it's the second biggest part of the global economy. It is, of course, where coronavirus started. They didn't have the kind of access early on to the Chinese health system, to Chinese data. And so as a consequence, it was very hard for them to work on the ground there in a way that it wouldn't have been if we were talking about Italy, for example, or South Korea, or the United States. And now you have Chinese officials floating the idea of creating a Chinese World Health Organization because they've got Belt and Road, they've got the architecture, why not put some ornaments on that tree? The ability of the IMF to respond effectively to global crises as they emerge. Well, the head of the IMF is increasingly talking about they aren't going to have the money to be able to support, for example, a bailout in Europe if they need it. Why? Because less money for the IMF, less political support internationally. The Europeans can and should be backstopped by Europe. The IMF will only be there for those countries that don't have anybody else. So the institutions are also getting weaker. So again, this geopolitical recession, a bust cycle in the geopolitical order because the institutions are not aligned with the geopolitical balance, because the alliances and the relations between countries are increasingly focusing not on coordination, but instead on what they need for their own national interests, every nation for itself, and also inside democracies around the world, both advanced industrial democracies and emerging market democracies. You increasingly have political polarization, blamesmanship, and a sense that the system and its establishment is rigged against the average citizen. Well, if you have all three of those things, there should be no surprise that the ability to respond effectively to the biggest global crisis we've had since 2008, and maybe larger than that, is going to be very, very severely lacking. So that's my ideas of where we are politically today. I'm sure I'll be back with you real soon. Talk to you guys.